Good morning and welcome to Paradigm's R&D Day. My name is Paul Rennie. I'm founder and Chief Executive Officer of Paradigm Biopharmaceuticals. I'd like to extend a special welcome to the people joining us from Hong Kong and Singapore, and also people from the United States of America, where it is Sunday afternoon or Sunday evening in the US. Next slide, please. As Paradigm is an ASX-listed company, we are required to provide a disclaimer in regards to forward-looking statements. And in particular, this is a presentation around the timelines and our expectations of clinical trials. And as we all know, they are subject to change, particularly within the context of a global pandemic. However, this is our best estimate of our timelines as of today, and any changes will of course be communicated to the market with regular ASX updates. Next slide, please. So I'd like to start with the objectives of Paradigm's R&D Day. Paradigm's R&D Day is a forum to provide you with a deep insight into Paradigm's research programs, which are of course our future new products, or in other words, this is Paradigm's pipeline. As an aside, I would like to just let everyone know that Paradigm is currently assessing 3 projects repurposing drugs other than PPS. So can I just stress that Paradigm is assessing 3 projects for repurposing drugs that are not PPS. So these will be other drugs that have been registered on the market, and Paradigm is looking at, through M&A activity, acquiring those assets to bring new products into our pipeline. Now, these details are currently the subject of confidentiality agreements, and therefore I would not be able to disclose those projects today. But just to let everyone know that we do have plans for projects well beyond our lead indication of osteoarthritis and a follow-on indication of MPS. The R&D Day will also provide you with a deep insight into our clinical development strategies and timelines for the lead program Xylosol for osteoarthritis and our orphan drug program PPS for mucopolysaccharidosis. I'd like to make 2 points in relation to the presentation today. All the presenters are experienced, very experienced people with commercial transactions with big pharma companies, or first-hand experience with regulatory submissions with the US FDA or the European EMA. So these are people who've sat at the front row of a desk with the FDA colleagues on the other side of the desk and have experience in terms of how to work through the FDA to get the best outcome for the company. This is not people who have theoretical understanding, but actual first-hand experience and relationships with people with the FDA. And I'm very pleased to say that the Paradigm staff who have been recruited in recent times is because of their successful track record and demonstration that they have first-hand experience with the regulatory authorities. Now, in relation to our clinical program strategy, when we are discussing a strategy or the strategies being formulated, we do so with the need of key stakeholders being front of mind for us as we develop those strategies. Those stakeholders are government agencies / healthcare companies, doctors and their patients, and of course shareholders. So all of those stakeholders are considered as part of our strategy as we move forward. And you'll be hearing from a number of those experienced staff members today, but because we don't have all day for this particular discussion, there are a number of other Paradigm staff who've contributed to our success, but who are not presenting today. And I'd just like to acknowledge some of the people who have contributed tremendously over the last 12 months. Dr. Carla Noah and Michelle Coffey in our global regulatory team, and Mel Dyker and Jill Forrest from our OA clinical development team, and Sharon Charles, who's in charge of operations for our MPS program. Also Beverly Hutman, who's the head of our commercial development division, and also Justin Cale, who's our CFO. And as you would have seen from announcements, both Beverly and Justin are from CSL and very familiar with the pharmaceutical industry. Now, talking about CSL, I'd now like to hand over to the moderator for today's R&D program, and that is Dr. Jeannie Jochen. So Jeannie, with pleasure, I hand over to you. Thank you.
Thank you for the introduction, Paul. I would also like to add my welcome and thanks to those of you who have joined the presentation today. Could I have the next slide, please? Before we get started, I'd like to remind you of the process so you can ask questions. Questions can be submitted at any time. And to ask a question, press on the speech bubble icon and this will open a new screen. At the bottom of that screen, there's a section for you to type your question. And once you've finished typing a question, hit the arrow symbol to send it. Please note that while you can submit questions at any time during this presentation, we will not address them until the end of the meeting. Please also note that your questions may be modified or shortened and even amalgamated together if we have multiple questions on the one topic. So we look forward to receiving your questions throughout the presentation. Next slide, please. Many of you need no introduction to Paradigm. However, I'm going to remind you of our vision. We aim to be the repurposing experts and strive to unlock the full potential of the products we investigate. There are obvious advantages to this approach. It takes around 10 to 15 years to bring a new molecule to market, and it's estimated that this effort costs, on average, over $1.2 billion US. Further, developing a product like injectable pentosan polysulfate sodium, or PPS as I'll refer to it from now on, which has been approved in another dosage form and has demonstrated safety, should result in a shorter path to market at a significantly reduced investment. However, the biggest advantage of our repurposing strategy is our ability to choose new potential therapeutic indications with high unmet clinical need. Today, you will not only hear more about our lead indication of osteoarthritis, which is a blockbuster potential due to the lack of approved products to treat growing patient pools of moderate to severe disease people. We'll also outline the exciting potential associated with our development pipeline for PPS. Next slide, please. Before we get underway, I would like to outline why Paradigm has so much confidence in PPS. When pharmaceutical companies develop new therapeutic candidates, they generally choose a specific pathway or target associated with either the etiology or the symptoms of the disease. In the example of osteoarthritis, we are aware that the disease pathogenesis involves many processes, including degradation of cartilage and remodeling of bone, and that patients experience the symptoms of pain or have impaired or reduced function of their joint. It is a complex and multifactorial disease. Clinical programs like those undertaken by companies such as Roche, Pfizer, Galapagos, and many others focus on single targets, often utilising specific monoclonal antibodies to block those targets, and they have demonstrated varying success. During 2020, programs in osteoarthritis blocking interleukin-6, nerve growth factor, and the enzyme ADAMTS-TS5 have either failed or have been associated with serious and unintended safety consequences. Later in today's presentation, our Chief Scientific Officer will further explain how injectable PPS interacts in these various pathways. But specifically in osteoarthritis, there is a great deal of clinical and preclinical evidence to demonstrate that injectable PPS is active through multiple modes of action, including decreasing inflammation by downregulating inflammatory cytokines, reducing the production of NGF, protecting cartilage by downregulating degrading enzymes, and repairing bone through improved blood flow. Results from our Phase 2B clinical program, as well as our Special Access Scheme in Australia and the Expanded Access Program in the US, have been very encouraging from an efficacy and safety perspective. We have valuable information around effect size, which has been used to inform our statistical plan to demonstrate significance in our clinical trial program. During 2020, Paradigm has taken the time and effort to consult with global regulators, and as a result, we are looking forward to commencing our pivotal program in 2021. Taken together, the demonstrated ability for PPS to reduce pain and improve function associated with osteoarthritis via multiple pathways, and now with a globally harmonised clinical trial plan derived from regulatory consultation, we have great confidence in the clinical and commercial success for xylitol. By the end of today's presentation, you will see Paradigm has chosen a very promising first product to repurpose. Next slide, please. Now for today's agenda. As mentioned by Paul, Paradigm has assembled a highly qualified and experienced team, and you will hear from some of them today. Firstly, our Chief Medical Officer, Dr. Donna Skerritt, will outline key aspects of our clinical trial program for osteoarthritis. Then, Dr. Michael Imperiale will provide an update on Paradigm's commitment to monitoring safety and on the clinical program for MPS. You'll learn more about our development pipeline for injectable PPS from our Chief Scientific Officer, Dr. Ravi Krishnan. And I will explain how our plan for potential revenue generation prior to global launch will evolve. Next slide, please. So I would like to invite Dr. Skerritt to provide an update on the clinical program for our lead indication. Thank you, Donna.
Thank you, Jeannie. Next slide, please. So the first thing I'd like to go through with you is the activity of this past year in order to obtain feedback from both EMA and FDA to achieve global harmonization in our clinical trial design. The purpose of this activity is to establish clarity around the regulatory pathway and the regulatory obligations for registration. And in that way, we're able to design our clinical trials to meet those obligations so that when we register or submit our trials for registration, they will meet the expectations that have previously been agreed upon with the regulatory bodies. So starting at the top of this slide, you'll see that we conducted some additional preclinical evaluations. These studies were done because PPS has been on the market for a long time. There were some studies that were quite old, and we repeated studies to ensure they meet the current regulatory qualifications. Next, we had a number of meetings, starting with a pre-IND meeting with the FDA in February of 2020. And at that meeting, we confirmed the requirement for a confirmatory clinical study in addition to our main pivotal study. And the basis for that is that this is a new indication that's being evaluated in a 505(b)(2) program. But because we're repurposing for a new indication, our data set for efficacy needed to include a pivotal and a confirmatory study. We then assembled our materials to have discussions with EMA under the Scientific Advice Program. And we've received that final scientific advice in September of this year. And some of the outcome of the advice with EMA was that we would require additional patients for the safety data set. And again, this being related to the fact that we're a new indication in a repurposing program, and we're working with a new dosing regimen than some of the prior commercial activity with PPS. We also, with EMA, confirmed the pivotal study primary and secondary endpoints and submitted our revised clinical trial design to the FDA for evaluation through a Type C meeting. We received the feedback from that Type C meeting in just this month in December, and that has confirmed for us now the revised trial design endpoints, the patient numbers. We've increased the number of patients in the studies to include for dropouts. That's a normal exercise, but particularly this year, because of COVID, we've felt the need to be very careful about our projections about dropouts and making sure we have an adequate database of patients to assess for efficacy. I'll also state that we had discussions around understanding what the minimally effective dose of PPS would be for this indication. And so we have agreed to include patients in the early part of our study in order to look at different doses, undergo a dose selection, and establish the minimally effective dose for proceeding further with the studies. I'd also like to just say a couple of further words about COVID. We've been working diligently with our clinical research organizations to understand how COVID affects clinical trial design and conduct. And as a result of the feedback that we've received, we've designed a program that will utilize multiple study sites with contingency plans in the event that site access or patient populations are impacted by COVID. Our studies will be conducted in a number of different regions in order to further mitigate against any major COVID impact on the study activity once the studies begin. So to reiterate, we have confirmed our intent to evaluate and determine a minimally effective dose. We've increased the number of patients based on regulatory feedback. We've reached an understanding regarding the clinical endpoints of WOMAC pain and WOMAC function. We've established a need for not only our pivotal, but also a confirmatory study. And we've also worked to improve and expand our label for simultaneous registration globally. And we're doing that by looking at a number of different aspects of how PPS affects patients with OA, osteoarthritis of the knee. The net effect of these activities is to de-risk our overall program. It leaves us with a high level of confidence that with successful trials, we will proceed with simultaneous registrations in global markets. And this de-risks the overall project, reducing the chance that additional data sets will be required at a later date. So in other words, we want to be sure that when we go to submit our registrations, we have the data that the regulatory authorities expect out of us for this indication. If we can now go to the next slide, we'll discuss the pivotal study and the confirmatory study. So we are conducting 2 adequate and well-controlled trials that are needed for supportive registration. These are shown on this slide. The studies will evaluate PPS in patients with chronic OA of the knee that is moderate to severe and has demonstrated damage to the knee on X-ray and has not responded to prior therapy with oral paracetamol or nonsteroidal agents. The studies were designed following extensive data analysis of our phase 2b studies in order for us to understand the treatment effects, the peak effects, any subgroup responses that would be important for our design of the clinical trials so that we could design trials with the best probability of success. The endpoints will measure the change from baseline in pain and function as assessed by the WOMAC scale. Patients will be then followed for 6 months to the end of study before rolling over to extension studies. And the extension studies are part of our overall OA program to enhance the registration packages with efficacy and safety data regarding PPS. And we'll talk more about those in just a minute. Next slide. So the primary study is PARA-002, which is shown here. That study is expected to begin enrollment in Q2 of 2021. And the confirmatory phase 3 study, PARA-003, will begin enrollment in Q4 and then complete near the end of 2023. And if we proceed to the next slide, we'll go into more detail about these studies. So again, the pivotal study and the confirmatory. The next study I'd like to review with you is PARA-006. Now, this is one of the extension studies. The extension study will evaluate patients who've completed 002. And these studies have been designed to provide additional information to enhance our label, such as demonstrating the duration of treatment effect, the responses to retreatment with PPS, and evaluate for biomarker assessments, either by radiograph or chemical biomarkers, to determine whether or not disease-modifying effects can be demonstrated. Next study, PARA-007. Now, this is the extension study to the confirmatory study 003. And that has the same purpose, to provide additional information that will be of importance for our developing the label for OA of the knee. The next study, is 008. Now, this is a study that will be conducted in Australia. It's actually the first one to begin enrolling patients in Q2 of 2021. This study will evaluate biomarkers in the blood and synovial fluid as indicators of the mechanisms of action of PPS in knee OA. The results from this study will help us to understand better how PPS works by evaluating the synovial fluid, and it will support a provisional approval application with the TGA. Next study, PARA-009. This is a study which will evaluate retreatment of PPS in OA patients at various intervals in order to support the use of PPS for multiple cycles over a patient's course of osteoarthritis. As we all know, osteoarthritis is a chronic disease, and so it is anticipated that patients may need more than one treatment course of PPS over their experience with osteoarthritis, and therefore we need to establish an understanding of the benefit from various intervals of retreatment so that the information can inform physicians once a drug is approved. The next study is PARA-010. And this study, it will evaluate PPS in patients with osteoarthritis of the hip. This work will be done simultaneously without delaying the overall timelines of the program. And we're doing this because there are many clinical similarities between knee OA and hip OA, and likewise a clinical need exists for both of these. In addition, the regulatory pathways for them are very similar. And therefore, we're going to obtain data on hip OA, so we will be able to provide this information and readily extend the indications to hip OA in addition to knee when we have adequate data for regulatory review. We can now go to the next slide. I'd like to, on this slide, review the subject numbers that will be evaluated with these various studies. And it's important to understand this because, as you've heard, this program is a repurposing program, but it is repurposing in a new indication and with a treatment regimen that is different from that from the previously approved and commercially used drug. So the studies that I've previously explained on the prior slides are, many of them are very large studies. The pivotal 002 study will have 938 subjects evaluated, and this study is large. It will initially look at doses so we can meet the minimal effective dose request from the FDA, and then select a dose and proceed with the phase 3 component of the study. So there are a number of patients who will be evaluated with the final selected dose in this study. The study will also have an increased size, as I mentioned, so that we cover the study for a sufficient number of dropouts, if that occurs, either due to the patient population or to any inconveniences due to the ongoing COVID pandemic. The following study, PARA-006, will evaluate 750 subjects. The confirmatory study, 003, will evaluate 700 subjects. The extension study will evaluate 560 subjects. And then the study in Australia, 008, which will look at synovial fluid, is a smaller study of 60 patients. And the retreatment study is expected to include 270 subjects. If you then go over to the column, these subjects will receive PPS or placebo. There will be an opportunity for placebo subjects to receive PPS after a certain time point in the study is met, so that all the primary endpoint and required follow-up is obtained. Then there's an opportunity for placebo subjects to receive PPS. And that's reflected, for example, next to 006 on that extension study will dose 282 PPS subjects. There'll be no placebos because they'll have the opportunity to cross over. And that will occur in some of the other studies as well. I especially want to draw your attention to the column on the far right. That describes the number of subjects who will contribute to the safety database for our registration. I mentioned earlier that we submitted this program for discussion to the FDA under the 505(b)(2) repurposing program with the intent to utilize some prior data and bridge to the current data. The FDA and then the EMA both said that based on this being a new indication and a new dosing regimen, we would need to establish an appropriate data set for this registration. And that number for the data set is shown here. It will be at least 1,400 subjects, possibly up to 1,500 subjects. I'd like to just point out, and we'll look at that in further detail in a minute, that all of these studies are timed in order to assure that the additional safety data readouts will be available when the efficacy data from the pivotal and confirmatory trial are available, and that therefore we will have our safety data set and our efficacy data set at the same time. So if you go to the next slide, please. This slide then shows us the timeline for all of this activity. It is certainly a lot of activity, and it shows how we spend our time, certainly to anyone who's involved in this business or spends time watching clinical trial activity. This slide is an overview of the news flow from the program. And so above the gray bar, what we have are the clinical milestones, the first subject in, the recruitment times, when the dose selection will take place, when all subjects will be recruited for a study, going all the way over to the far right, showing when all of the extension study subjects will have been recruited. So by that time, we'll be into 2023. I think what's really important for many people on this call is to look at the stars that are below the gray bar. These are the data readout times. So the first readout that we'll have is in Q3 of 2021. The 08 study evaluating biomarkers will have a primary endpoint readout, followed later in Q2 of 2022 of the final data readout from that study evaluating patients with OA by synovial fluid and serum biomarkers, and also looking at the same clinical endpoints so we can make correlations around biomarkers and clinical endpoint. Then looking along on the timeline, Q1 2023, we'll have the retreatment study interim safety data available. And importantly, look below that, OA Para-002, which is the pivotal phase 3 study, the data readout. So that's Q1 of 2023. Looking further to the right, at Q3 2023, we see the interim safety readout from the extension studies of 007 and 006. So that's a follow along to both of the phase 3 studies. And then looking below, we'll have the data readout from 10, the HIP study, and most importantly, 003, which is our confirmatory data readout. So the 2 phase 3 studies have their readouts in Q1 2023 and Q3 2023. And it's at this point that we will have all the data that will compile the dossiers that will be prepared to put before the regulatory agencies. Obviously, there is a bit of time involved in writing the final study reports, preparing the regulatory documents that go in for submission. The extensive materials, review of materials are submitted to the agent. The different jurisdictions have varying review periods for registration materials that can range to about 10 months. If there is a fast track designation in the US, which we intend to seek, that could reduce the review time to about 6 months, but we're looking at anywhere around 6 to 10 months for those registration review periods. So importantly, we just want to relay to you the time and the planning that's gone into developing protocols that have undergone scrutiny from the regulatory bodies and have responded to that feedback, so that we have designed trials that not only meet the expectations for demonstrating efficacy, but also provide the safety data set in order to put before the regulators for registration. Next slide, please. I'd now like to introduce Dr. Michael Imperial, who has joined Paradigm as the global head of safety and the clinical head of the MPS program. Paradigm has made a strategic decision to establish a comprehensive in-house safety program to demonstrate our commitment to patient safety from development through commercialization. Dr. Imperial will tell you a little bit about his background and then describe the programs he leads.
My name is Michael Imperial, as Donna had nicely mentioned and introduced me. I am a relatively new member of the Paradigm team. I have over 20 years of experience in the pharmaceutical biotechnology industry, and I've worked in many different therapeutic areas, among those pain and rare diseases. More specifically, I've worked in developing therapeutics for osteoarthritis and lysosomal storage diseases. I was fortunate enough to lead the global team at BioMarin for the development of Naglazyme, which is their enzyme replacement therapy for the treatment of MPS 6. Next slide, please. Paradigm, as Donna has mentioned, has made a very serious commitment and an investment in building an internal safety team and an infrastructure that will support all of our safety needs for all of our clinical programs. Myself, as head of global safety, Inga Gerblinken, who is our internal safety physician, and Synteract, who is our safety CRO that holds our fully validated safety database. The data that is held within this database is the data that we will use for our analysis of all of our safety clinical studies. We'll do our safety analysis for all of our clinical studies, and this is where we will also pull the information when we do our submissions for our NDAs. This will ensure accurate and consistent safety data to manage patients and support a successful NDA submission for all of our programs. This very effective team took on the review of all of the literature and historical data of PPS, as well as the data from the Paradigm clinical programs. This provided the team with a thorough and complete understanding of the safety profile of PPS. All of this was completed by this team and put in place prior to the dosing of our first patient in the MPS program and prior to dosing in the current OA clinical trials. Next slide, please. I think, as we all know, there are no cures for mucopolysaccharidoses. Bone marrow transplant and enzyme replacement therapy for MPS 1 and enzyme replacement therapy for MPS 6 are treatments and not cures. And even with these treatments, patients experience pain. This pain impedes their activities of daily living. And we strongly believe that PPS will demonstrate an improvement in joint mobility and pain and have a significant impact on the lives of patients with MPS. Paradigm received orphan designation for PPS for the treatment of MPS, both in the EU and in the US. We are currently enrolling our MPS 1 program in Australia. It is being run at Women's and Children's Hospital in Adelaide. It is an open label, currently enrolling up to 10 subjects. We dose weekly for 12 weeks and then every other week for a total of 52 weeks. The primary endpoint is safety, with key secondary endpoints as pain and function and pharmacokinetics. 2 subjects currently in treatment. 1 subject has just completed week 7 and subject 2 has completed week 3. PPS has been well tolerated in both of these subjects with no safety concerns reported. We are in the process of planning an MPS 6 study in Brazil. The reason that we are running this study in Brazil is because there's a very large MPS 6 patient population in that country. This is a double-blinded, placebo-controlled trial with 12 subjects dosed weekly for 24 weeks. I want to just call your attention to the fact that this is a double-blinded, placebo-controlled study, and this will provide Paradigm with comparator data of the activity of PPS versus placebo in the MPS 6 patient population. The primary endpoint is safety, with key secondary endpoints as pain and function, as well as pharmacokinetics. The Brazilian regulatory agency, Anvisa, has confirmed acceptability of Paradigm's clinical program and study endpoints. Taken together, we believe strongly that this will be a robust data set that will allow us to inform future MPS activities and partnering discussions for Paradigm. At this time, I'd like to introduce you to our Chief Scientific Officer, Dr. Ravi Krishna.
Thank you, Michael. Could I have the next slide, please? PPS is a highly sulfated polysaccharide with multiple mechanisms of action. The multiple actions of PPS are mediated by targeting both NF-kappa B dependent and NF-kappa B independent pathways. The activation of the transcription factor NF-kappa B is involved in key pathological processes in both acute and chronic diseases. As demonstrated in this diagram, PPS is an inhibitor of NF-kappa B. Peer-reviewed scientific publications have confirmed that PPS binds to NF-kappa B and prevents the translocation of NF-kappa B into the nucleus, where NF-kappa B initiates the expressions of genes that lead to the inflammatory cascade. The inhibition of NF-kappa B by PPS results in the regulation of pathological processes involved in inflammation through the transcription of inflammatory cytokines such as interleukin-1, TNF-alpha, and IL-6, pain through the production of nerve growth factor, adverse tissue remodeling or tissue degradation through the increased levels of enzymes such as ADAMTS4 and 5 that degrade tissues, and vascular inflammation and dysfunction through the induction of cell adhesion molecules. In addition to targeting NF-kappa B directly, PPS can also act in an NF-kappa B independent manner. Examples of NF-kappa B independent effects include PPS as a direct enzyme inhibitor of ADAMTS4 and ADAMTS5, PPS as a direct inhibitor of nerve growth factor gene expression. PPS has antithrombotic effects, which improves vascular perfusion. PPS has tissue regenerative properties by directly increasing the production of hyaluronic acid, which is degraded in osteoarthritic joints and other tissues, including the myocardium in heart failure. The key take-home message is that the multiple mechanisms of actions of PPS regulate disease processes such as inflammation, pain, adverse tissue remodeling, and vascular dysfunction that are common to many acute and chronic medical indications. Furthermore, PPS has a substantial advantage in yielding clinically meaningful outcomes compared to pharmaceutical agents which target single disease pathways. Could I have the next slide, please? The multiple mechanisms of action allow the repurposing of PPS across a number of acute and chronic medical indications. Paradigm's approach has been to obtain robust scientific data using preclinical proof of concept animal disease models to support the mechanisms of action of PPS, which target specific disease indications. The rationale for the use of PPS to target other indications is based on the mechanisms of action of PPS as illustrated in this slide. With regard to alpha viral-induced arthritis, examples are Ross River virus and chikungunya virus, PPS actions involve targeting inflammation, pain, and joint degradation. This work is currently in progress at the Glycomics Institute in Queensland using animal models of chikungunya virus infection. With regard to heart failure, PPS actions involve targeting ADAMTS4 present in myocardial tissues, which causes adverse tissue remodeling, as well as inflammation and vascular endothelial effects, which affect cardiac function. The proof of concept model and dose translation studies are planned to be performed at the Center of Heart Failure Research and Institute for Experimental Research at Oslo University, using an industry standard animal model of heart failure. With regard to the respiratory indication of viral-induced acute respiratory distress syndrome, ARDS, PPS actions involve targeting the cytokine storm response via anti-inflammatory effects mediated by the inhibition of NF-kappa B and supported by the additional role of PPS as an inhibitor of complement activation, which is involved in lung tissue degeneration. The preclinical proof of concept study is currently being carried out at the Menzies Health Institute in Queensland. In summary, the multiple actions of PPS provide the rationale for the use of PPS in treating other medical indications beyond osteoarthritis and MPS. So we look forward to updating the market as we accrue data from these very exciting preclinical models for Paradigm's pipeline products. I will now hand over to my colleague, Dr. Jeannie Jochen, who will present the next slide. Thank you.
Thank you, Ravi. Next slide, please. Concurrently with the clinical trial program that has been shared with you today, Paradigm is exploring opportunities to make xylazole available to patients earlier and to bring forward revenue generation prior to global registration. The first program will be in patients with Ross River virus. There is an unmet clinical need for a treatment to reduce the symptoms of chronic arthralgia associated with Ross River virus infection. Paradigm will publish clinical results from a study conducted in patients post-infection with persistent pain and impaired joint function in early 2021, and is planning to make xylazole available via the Special Access Scheme in Australia. The timing will roughly coincide with the identification of chronic and persistent arthralgia in patients post the Ross River virus infection period. So that will be towards the end of Q2 calendar year 2021. After we've completed recruitment at Australian sites for the pivotal 002 study that was presented earlier, we also plan to recommence the SAS program for osteoarthritis. We anticipate that this will commence in Q3 calendar year 2021, as we do not want to compete with patients for the pivotal study. We want to ensure that the enrolment is as quick as it can be. Both the SAS programs will be pay for use, and research is currently underway to determine the pricing. Now, regarding the TGA provisional approval for the use of xylazole, as previously reported, we have progressed through the first stage of the application process with the TGA. We are confident we can meet the requirements of unmet clinical need in a serious condition. In order to progress to stage 2, we believe additional data from the Australian 008 study will provide further and compelling evidence of improvement in pain and function through disease modification, as demonstrated by exploratory biomarkers, and they'll be exploratory biomarkers in the serum and the synovial fluid. In addition, the global pivotal and confirmatory studies will be well underway, providing confidence to the TGA that we can deliver a full registration package for assessment. If successful in our application for provisional approval, we could anticipate registration late 2023 with sales in early 2024, ahead of global registration. Gaining provisional approval would allow Paradigm the opportunity of marketing xylazole and provide valuable information regarding patient uptake and market penetration. Lastly, we have been in discussion with potential global and regional partners regarding licensing and collaboration. We anticipate this activity will only increase once we've submitted our IND and commenced the pivotal trial. This will increase the potential of receiving milestone payments prior to regulatory submission of xylazole. However, we will continue to keep our options open by partnering each indication at the appropriate time to ensure that we increase the value of this exciting asset. Next slide, please. In summary, we have aimed to demonstrate today the reasons we are so confident of achieving global registration once our trials are successfully completed. The multimodal action of PPS, using previous trials to inform study size for statistical significance, understanding there is a high potential for placebo responses in pain, and therefore conducting specific training for centres and subjects in how to record pain, and global regulatory consultation all contribute to our confidence. We have and will continue to recruit a highly qualified and experienced team to ensure optimal execution of our clinical trial program. Once we have opened our IND, we will have a highly desirable asset for partnering, This will provide us with further optionality for funding. While conducting the pivotal and confirmatory trials, we are also planning and executing initiatives to strengthen the label, like adding in hip OA, for example, and also improving patient access and convenience. Having a path to revenue prior to global launch will open opportunities for partnering and funding and allow us to seek non-dilutive investment if required. And as you have also seen, further research with PPS has unlocked an exciting pipeline for treatment in conditions including MPS, acute respiratory syndrome, and heart failure. By being transparent today with our strategy, we have aimed to demonstrate that we take our obligations seriously. Paradigm has sought, received, and reviewed valuable feedback from global regulators to avoid pitfalls in our clinical program, and is taking the necessary steps to achieve regulatory and commercial success. We hope that you feel as confident and as excited as we do about the opportunities for xylosol in osteoarthritis, for injectable PPS in other indications, and indeed Paradigm as we seek to unlock the product's true potential. Next slide, please. That brings to a close our presentation, and we will now move on to your questions. And we thank you for the questions that we have received. In this section, I will direct a question to one of the panel, and they will then be able to answer the question as it was received. So my first question is actually to Ravi. Ravi, is Paradigm expecting more peer-reviewed science to be published on the mechanism of action? Or do you believe that we have enough already published to satisfy any regulators' expectations? Thank you, Ravi.
Thank you, Jeannie. There is sufficient mechanism of action data based on the mechanism of action information that I have presented today. These are peer-reviewed and published that describe the targets on inflammation, pain, tissue degeneration, and vascular dysfunction. We will be certainly publishing data on the effects of PPS on the biomarkers in synovial fluid in osteoarthritis patients. This, we believe, will provide data on disease-modifying effects of PPS. So thus far, I think we have sufficient data on the mechanism of actions, but certainly our intention is to publish all our clinical data, and the upcoming data on the mechanisms of action of PPS with regard to biomarkers in synovial fluid will provide excellent translational data that would be of great interest to the agencies. Thank you.
Great, thanks, Ravi. Donna, this next question is for you. What do you see as the greatest risk to passing the phase 3 trials?
Thank you, Jeannie. I see the greatest risk to passing phase 3 trials in general is inadequate trial design. It takes a lot of work and a lot of thought to design a trial that fits your product and the way it behaves in the patient population you want to evaluate, and to make sure that those goals are consistent with the regulatory expectations. So, for example, our design for PPS and OA included evaluation of a lot of data that we have on arthritis patients through our prior phase 2B controlled study, as well as the large data set from the SAS patients, so that we could do multiple analyses to try to understand the time to response, the peak responses, what the treatment effect sizes were, and then use them to build various models for clinical trial. How large would it have to be to show a certain treatment effect? And what is the effect that the regulators will look for? And what will the practicing physicians look for? Or where do they see the clinical need? So all of these things need to be taken into consideration to design a trial that has the best probability of success. And that's not a quick exercise. And as you've seen on our overview slides, it's taken us time to work out all these aspects and then to assure that what we put forth as clinically meaningful is what the clinical community as well as the regulatory community sees as meaningful. So that time in trial design is much better spent upfront before you enroll the first patient than in trying to learn to jump in quickly and sort of learn as you go along. So the time has to be put in upfront, and a lot of consideration of data needs to take place to design a trial with the best probability for success.
Thanks, Dawn. Paul, this next question is for you. Japan has roughly 26 million people aged over 40 that suffer from NEOA. You have detailed your process for registration in Europe and the United States and Australia. What is the company's development plan to achieve registration in Japan?
Yes, thanks, Jeannie, and thanks for the question. And I think everyone should know that currently Paradigm is in a discussion with a particular partner in Japan, and it would be detailed to the market if and when that arrangement changes, but it would be premature to discuss it in any more detail here because it is an ongoing negotiation and obviously commercially sensitive. But Japan is, as the question has said, is a very significant market. It's one that we believe requires a Japanese partner to execute and have the product registered in Japan. So it's well within our plans, but at this stage, we would just say that it's the subject of a current negotiation on foot, which we'll disclose at some future stage.
Thanks, Paul. Now, the next question has been posed to either Paul or myself, so I'm going to take it since it's more commercially related. It asks us about the indications that Paradigm has in its pipeline and how are we going to decide on which next indication will be meaningful to pursue. So I just wanted to make a point that for all of the potential indications, obviously as they pass through research and the stage gates, our commercial group is undertaking an evaluation of the patient population, the competitor situation, and putting together a detailed commercial assessment on all of our research programs. And so we work with the clinical and the scientific team to update this regularly as more information comes through. So when it comes to a time where we need to decide where we will invest, we will look at the probability of success of that program and then also the highest unmet clinical need and the greatest potential on the investment. So I hope that answers that question. The next question is for Paul. Will the increase in patients require additional capital? Previous communication was the phase 3 was fully funded, and that was on a lot fewer numbers than were presented today. Is the company expecting a partnering or distribution deal in the future?
Yes, thanks, Jeannie, and thanks again for the question. As Dr. Skerritt has outlined, the phase 3 comprises our studies PARA-002 and PARA-003. So that is the pivotal phase 3 clinical trial plus the confirmatory phase 3 clinical trial. And we expect to deliver on those with the funds that we currently have. And we are leaving our options open for funding for the future, which certainly includes partnerships, as well as other forms of non-dilutive funding. But we certainly are pursuing, once we get the phase 3 trial open, a number of inquiries that we've had from commercial companies, particularly over the last few weeks, that have reached out to us, given the fact that we have now been able to make the market aware that we have if you like, the go ahead with both Europe and the United States. So a global phase 3 program is a very attractive asset, and I think we will probably see some collaboration, some sort of deal sometime in the coming months, but that has to be tempered by the fact that some of these big pharma deals can take some time to materialize, but certainly we're keeping all our options open for the future. But as Dr. Skerritt also said, I hope investors get the understanding that achieving phase 3 success is one part of the equation, but our equation has always been to try and maximize the investor's return by getting the product registered. And those additional studies that we've spoken about come from discussions with the regulatory agencies, with patients and doctors, to understand that there are certain data that the agency requires, and they'll be achieved through those other studies. So they're very important to registration, and obviously we're going to do everything we can to run all of those studies concurrently, so that we can, shortly after the confirmatory study is read out, move on to registration as quickly as possible. And that's always been our plan. And if we require to do funding during that term, we will certainly look at it. But we don't want to be entering into a deal that is not going to maximise the tremendous value that we've built up in this asset. Thanks, Jenny.
Okay, well, Donna, there's a couple of questions, so I'll put you on notice for a question after you finish answering the first one. So with respect to the phase 3 trial for OA, are we planning to apply for any special designation, for example, fast track or priority designation?
Thank you, Jeannie. Yes, we plan to apply for fast track designation. We're working on that application now. The benefit of having fast track allows for more interaction with the FDA, and then also eligibility for priority review at the time of submission of the registration materials. And so that in itself could reduce the regulatory review time from 10 months to about 6 months. So it would help us save time and also allow further interaction with the FDA.
Great. And the second question is really around a comment that you made that related to revised design and endpoints for the phase 3 program. And if you could be a bit more specific on how that is different from the Australian phase 2B program.
Oh, certainly. Well, first of all, there are more similarities to the phase 2B than differences. We find it very important to design a study that is based on data of our product in the patient population in order to understand what behavior to expect and how to design the phase 3 trial. So the primary endpoint will be pain and function. In the phase 2B, we assess that by the KOOS scale. We'll be using the WOMAC scale for this study. We have done additional analyses of the phase 2 data looking at WOMAC. We know that the treatment effects are very consistent. So that's one thing, just the measure of WOMAC and not KOOS. The other thing is that the study is much larger, of course, in the phase 2B. In the phase 2B, we were able to explore the primary endpoint. Here in phase 3, we have to have very specific, statistically thought out endpoints and predict what the different effects would be that would define success. And to do that, which is a very involved statistical exercise, really does require that we evaluate many more patients than in the prior study. So the patient population is the same in terms of knee OA with chronic pain that's moderate to severe, KL grade 2 to 4 on x-rays, and not having had adequate response to prior oral therapy. So as I said, more similarities than differences from the phase 2B.
Great, thank you. Michael, we have a question regarding the MPS 6 study. Because the MPS 6 study will be around 26 weeks in duration, I think we have some interest around when we will have a readout and what the rough timetable for the entire trial would be.
Thank you, Jeannie, and thank you for the question. As I mentioned earlier during my presentation, the MPS 6 study is a double-blinded placebo-controlled study. And so it's extremely important for the integrity of the study that the last patient complete his last assessment before the database is locked. And then we will actually be able to do our analysis and share the data. Again, there are a couple of caveats on timelines, as there always are. It's going to depend on our regulatory approvals and the timing of those approvals. Our internal anticipation to be able to share some very top-line data would be the end of 2022 or first quarter 2023.
Great, thank you, Michael. The next study question's a rather interesting one. I'm not sure who will be best to answer it, to be honest, but Ravi, Paul and Donna, what evidence by a human study do we have that will show that PPS will not have the same safety issues as the Pfizer and Lilly product, the anti-NGF product?
Jeannie,
Ravi, Donna, Paul?
Jeannie, yeah, thank you.
I think that's a Ravi will answer that. Yeah.
I was going to say, Jeannie, thank you for the question, and I think Dr. Krishnan will answer that, and it's important, I think, for interested parties to review the peer review publication that has been published on this particular question, but I'll let Dr. Krishnan answer it quite specifically.
Yeah, thank you for the question. So essentially, rapidly progressing osteoarthritis is the key safety issue reported by Pfizer and Lilly for their product. The Pfizer product is essentially a nerve growth factor sequestering monoclonal antibody. The mechanism of action of PPS is quite different from that of the Pfizer product. It actually reduces the expression of nerve growth factor, but does not ablate the expression completely. In addition, PPS has very interesting cartilage or chondroprotecting activity as I have described in the mechanism of action. So firstly, this is initiated by its ability to inhibit the degradation of cartilage by targeting enzymes ADAMTS4 and TS5. This is quite remarkable because PPS not only reduces the expression of these enzymes, but also acts as an inhibitor of these enzymes. But also, more interestingly, PPS has been shown to induce the expression of hyaluronic acid in the joints of osteoarthritis. So these are all mechanisms that suggest that PPS is more protective and quite different from the observations made in the Pfizer study. And I should also like to point out that our phase 2B data that we had reported had demonstrated BML progression to be significantly reduced by PPS treatment in comparison to the placebo group. So we have very strong evidence that PPS is not going to demonstrate those significant safety signals that the Pfizer and Lilly product have been reported to do so. Thank you.
Great, thank you.
Jenny, sorry, I might just get Ravi to elucidate a little bit more about the mechanism of PPS and how it downregulates NGF. Ravi explained that the Pfizer-Lilly antibody sequesters all of the NGF that's produced by the cells. Ravi might want to talk about how PPS works in that setting.
Yes. So PPS can target nerve growth factor either at the level of NF-kappa B, as I mentioned, or in an NF-kappa B independent manner. And essentially, nerve growth factor has got some importance with regard to promoting the growth of cartilage cells. And as I have said, the added activity of PPS is its ability to induce the expression of factors that support cartilage growth. So PPS in its own right has been shown to be a growth factor that facilitates cartilage growth, and also the added effects on the extracellular matrix proteins also facilitates the chondroprotective action. So it's a variety, as we've said. The multiple actions of PPS basically provide this added advantage of PPS, unlike those agents that are monospecific, only targeting one pathway. So this is the advantage that we have with PPS. So thank you. Paul, if you want to add any further, please do. Comments on that.
Thanks, Ravi. I'll always take the opportunity to chime in if offered, so thank you. I was trying to, just for the listeners' sake, to make the point that the way that tanezumab works by soaking up all of the NGF that is produced by the cells is different to the way PPS works. PPS works at the cellular level by having the cells down-regulate the expression of NGF in the first place, not completely block it and switch it off, but actually just return it back to baseline. So it's a different mechanism, and for that reason, it does seem to have a very different safety profile compared to tanezumab. And I think the paper makes that very clear. That's the Stapleton et al. Paper, makes it very clear that PPS is working at the cellular level as opposed to blocking the produced NGF. So it switches the production of NGF off. So once those subchondral osteocytes are stimulated in the osteoarthritis setting, they produce a lot of NGF, and PPS has a way of just quietly down-regulating the ongoing expression of NGF and returning it more to baseline. Thanks, Ravi.
Thank you. Donna, I have a couple of questions for you. The first is, you mentioned that we're establishing dosing in part 1 of Para 002, and the question is, haven't we already established the dose?
Thanks, Jeannie. Our prior clinical work in OA, in osteoarthritis, utilized a dose given twice a week. There is some experience in the literature with PPS and OA with effective responses seen when the drug was given once a week. When we had our discussions with the FDA at the pre-IND meeting, they asked us to look at additional dosing to try to establish the lowest effective dose. And so we agreed to do that. It is something that is expected in the development program. We're doing it as the first part of Para 02. Sort of the first stage will look at dosing, and the most effective dose will be selected with very detailed and predefined criteria in order for us to feel confident going forward with the dose selected. So this is really meeting a regulatory requirement. We know what effects we've seen with the dose study, and the question is, could we see that effect with a lower dose?
Great, thanks. And the second follow-up question is, what due diligence have we performed on the CRO we've chosen, and do they have experience in pain studies?
Certainly. So we did a lot of diligence. We actually had a very formal process to look at CROs, not only for their clinical support, but for safety and biostatistics and data management support. And we had bid defenses, we had group meetings, and we had separate sort of scoring of the CROs based on their capabilities. The CRO that we have chosen for osteoarthritis is one that has a lot of experience in pain studies and a lot of experience in OA. And we selected them because during the early interviews, they were very, it was obvious that they had experience, and they were very willing and forthcoming to share that experience and their knowledge with us, particularly on the aspect of pain studies. Pain studies can be very challenging in terms of placebo effects. And this CRO has worked with us to actually subcontract with a group that specializes in training the patients and how they understand and answer questions about pain. They train the physicians in the sites about interactions with patients that do not lead to expected responses. And so this is a very specialized area in evaluating pain and controlling the placebo response. And so the CRO we've selected for OA is really the top of the line for this kind of study. And if I could speak briefly for the MPS program, MPS is an orphan disease. And sometimes the CROs that work in orphan spaces are quite different. So we did select a CRO that has experience not only in orphan diseases, that is their specialty, and they also have experience and a lot of contacts and understanding of MPS. So we chose a separate CRO for that study.
Great, thank you, Donna. The next question relates to our expectations of uptake for the SAS programs for both Ross River virus and knee osteoarthritis, and how we're going to price these programs. I think I'll take that question as it was on one of my slides. I think it's probably known that with Ross River fever, not everybody gets persistent arthralgia. And in fact, there's on average around 5,000 cases of Ross River virus per year in Australia. And of those, around 11% have reported persistent arthralgia and pain, which lasts for more than 3 months. So there's a potential pool of just over 500 patients there. And obviously not all of them would be eligible for PPS treatment. So when it comes to the numbers that we're talking about, you can see why I did mention on the slide that we would only anticipate modest uptake. When it comes to pricing, we don't have any update on that for you at the moment. We're doing some pricing sensitivity analysis. It's very important that we don't just come out with any price, because once you come out with a price, that's the price for the product. And we believe that we'll be having some very interesting data to show the disease modification and the benefits in disease modification as a result of treating with PPS. So we don't want to undervalue our product, and we want to get the pricing right. So when we have more information, we'll be able to update you on that. That will probably be towards the end of Q2 calendar year 2021. Okay, the next question I have is a safety-related question for you, Michael. given the discovery of a potential retinal damage from the oral PPS in cystitis, what are the implications for injectable PPS?
Thank you, Jeannie, and thank you for the question. We have looked in great depth and detail to the pigmentary maculopathy that has recently been described for the Almiron product. I think it's important to keep in mind that this is a different route of administration, that this is an oral drug. It's dosed at 100 milligrams 3 times a day. So the dosing is considerably higher, and the duration and exposure is considerably higher than what we are doing with subcutaneous PPS. All of that said, we do believe we have a responsibility to our patients to follow this and to make sure that we monitor it closely. So we have implemented into all of our protocols retinal examinations that will take place. And if we see any changes in the retina, we will deal with them immediately. Again, we don't feel that with the short duration of time of which we are dosing our patients with our sub-Q PPS, that it really follows the profile of what has been seen with the Almiron product. The shortest amount of time that Almiron has reported pigmentary maculopathy is 3 years of therapy. But it's actually, if you really dig into the data deeply, it's more between 5 and 7 years. So although we don't really feel that our product with its exposure and also its route of administration will be a problem, nonetheless, we are following it up thoroughly, and all of our patients who enter any of our protocols will be evaluated for it.
Great, thank you. Paul, the next question is for you. We may need to have some clarification here. Can you confirm if Paradigm is in discussions for a partner for OA with a timeline possibly of months?
Was that in relation to Japan? I think if people are talking about Japan, I would have to say that timeline is not within months. It would have to be considerably longer than that, just because of the way that the Japanese process works. So I wouldn't be trying to estimate that Japanese partnership would be within months. I would say it's more likely measured outside of 12 months. If people are suggesting that the OA program be partnered with a US or European company, we have had discussions with companies both in the US and Europe, and those discussions are ongoing. We think the announcement around the R&D opening will also generate some inbound interest. We also are presenting, as we have today, a detailed analysis of Paradigm at the JP Morgan next month in January. And we expect from that there will be sufficient interest from pharma companies. We also have had some inquiries from US fund managers around what is the learnings that we can take from the failure of the Galapagos ADAMS TS5 inhibitor versus Paradigm's reduction in ADAMS TS5. And obviously we've explained that in terms of the difference of the mechanism and Galapagos product being a monospecific target, whereas PPS being a combination of many moieties having different pharmaceutical actions. ADAMS TS5 blocking is a activity of Pendicin, but it's not a similar product to Galapagos. So I think that's created a lot of interest in the US, given the fact that this is a blockbuster market. But again, those discussions with existing potential partners are ongoing, and I would expect that maybe once the IND is open, that might accelerate. But again, I wouldn't want to put a time on it of months. These things can take some time, but obviously, if the right deal comes along and the right partner comes along, we'd be more than happy to explore that. Does that clarify it, Jenny?
Yes, thank you, Paul. Donna, there's another question here for you about the spread of subjects anticipated between the USA and Australia, and will we be able to be flexible to account for possible COVID delays?
Thanks, Jeannie. So this is a large study. We're anticipating 55 sites in the USA and 10 in Australia, and they will be regionally dispersed. And one of the reasons for that, of course, is to be able to reach the largest number of patients possible. But that also does provide us with some flexibility in the event of delays due to COVID. Our teams have been working on this since COVID first appeared, on what the impact will be on clinical trials, and there have been guidances from all of the regulators and protocols established with our CROs for how to best mitigate around COVID-related delays. So yes, we will be very flexible in terms of any inconveniences due to COVID.
Thanks, Donna. And remaining on the subject of COVID, Ravi, one of our questioners, comments that PPS does downregulate interleukin-6, and that has a lot to do with COVID. So are we having any potential in our ARDS program in COVID?
Thank you for the question. Yes. So our approach with our preclinical models has been quite conservative. We are examining ARDS in an animal model of influenza. Now, this animal model actually produces a cytokine storm response where IL-6 is upregulated. And our intention is to demonstrate that PPS has efficacy in reducing the IL-6 signal in that model, and subsequently showing improvement in lung function. Now, if we get these positive data, our intention would be looking at a COVID model of ARDS. And with this respect, it involves a different animal model, the ACE2 transgenic mouse model. And our intentions will be to look at that model. But as I've said, our approach has been conservative, and we'd like to do this in a scientific approach, step by step. If we can demonstrate effects in the influenza model, certainly it can be used in the COVID model. But certainly what we are looking at is the effectiveness of PPS in COVID or non-COVID ARDS mediated effects. So thank you.
Thanks, Ravi. Paul, there's a question here to you that previously you reported discussions with the US Department of Defense with regards to Ross River virus. The question is, has there been any progress?
Thank you, Jeannie, and thank you for the question. Yes, I made contact with the US Department of Defense around the middle of this year. I explained to them that we had very good data from the Ross River Phase 2A clinical study that Paradigm undertook. It was a relatively small study of around 20 subjects. It was double-blind, placebo-controlled. And those data were very exciting, and they have been written up by Dr. Krishnan and his team and submitted for peer review and publication. So the Department of Defense was very excited, but obviously Ross River virus is a surrogate for their main interest, which is chikungunya. And they asked if we had any further data on that. And as Dr. Krishnan outlined in his study, there is additional work being done with chikungunya and PPS at the University Institute of Glycomics, Griffith University in Queensland. And there they are looking at various biomarkers showing how PPS can downregulate the inflammatory storm that is associated with that disease, and also the arthralgia and also myalgia that's a response of that infection. So they're very much looking forward to our data once it is either published or once we have the study report from Griffith University, which will be forthcoming in the next month or two, sending it to them to investigate their thoughts around the potential for using PPS as emergency therapy for people with chikungunya within their ranks, which obviously is a disease that currently doesn't have any registered therapeutics for. So yes, the discussions are ongoing, and it would be great to say that we've got something confirmed and in paper and sales on board, but that is not the case. We are still working our way through that. But to say that they are engaged and excited and looking forward to our next shipment of data is accurate.
Great, thank you, Paul. I guess there are a couple of questions we haven't answered, but I do note that it's 12:30 and we had planned to stop at this time. We will be able to answer your questions separately, and obviously the copy of this presentation as well as the download of the presentation will be available on our website. So with that, I think this brings our presentation to a close, and we're really grateful for your attention today. And mostly we'd like to thank our staff and all shareholders for continuing efforts and support. And finally, we wish you a very safe and happy holiday season. Thank you, and we look forward to speaking with you again soon. Bye for now.
Thanks, Jeannie.